Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar on a new platform for growth, building green infrastructure. I know we have civil servants joining us from all around the world, so it might be morning or evening to you. A very big hello from me. I'm Siobhan Benita. I'm a former senior civil servant here in the United Kingdom, and I'm chairing this webinar today on behalf of the Global Government Forum, which is a publishing house which serves civil servants all around the world. And I'd also like to thank our knowledge partner today, Mott MacDonald, for their support with this event and for sharing some of their expertise with us as well. So in terms of today's topic, building green infrastructure, this is set in the context of countries as we tentatively look to coming out of the pandemic. Lots of governments are thinking about their social and economic recoveries. And there is real indication, that lots of governments are thinking about how they can do this in a really sustainable way. And I'm sure we've all heard that phrase, build back better. And I think there are some indications around the world that governments are really trying to build in kind of new technologies, green technologies into their recoveries. And some really positive things like the election of Joe Biden in America, for example, which hopefully will see the re-engagement of key player, the United States, in the kind of global efforts to tackle climate change. But I think as we look to see this, there's a recognition as countries look to kind of building back in the greenest possible way that some of the low-hanging fruits have already been done, so that this really isn't going to be easy. And I think civil servants and governments, they're all grappling with some really big issues, around how do we, the electrification of our transport systems, looking at changing our national grids so that you have greener, more locally produced energy sources, and those really large scale changes that are going to be needed to our domestic heating and insulation systems. So today, with the help of a really brilliant expert panel, we're going to be exploring some of those issues, looking at how governments really do need to tackle the infrastructure required to support green business growth, reduce pollution, decarbonize their economies. What incentives, what regulations and policies are they going to use to drive change? And importantly, in a post-COVID world where finances are tighter than ever, what are the main investment challenges and opportunities for them in terms of green infrastructure and growth? In a moment, I'm going to introduce our fantastic panel. We have 4 real experts with us today, and each panel member will give some opening remarks. But we will also have time after they've spoken to take questions from you, our audience. So you should have a Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. At any time, please use that function to message in your questions. Take this opportunity to ask these experts that we have with us any questions that you have on this subject, and we will take as many of those questions as we can. Now to our fantastic panel members. So firstly, we are going to hear from Ivo Ianiso, who is head of the Construction and Housing Department at the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Communications in Estonia. With a background in construction design and construction management, in his current role, Ivo is in charge of Estonia's construction strategy and regulation, sustainability, digitalization and housing, and is really focused on helping Estonia to become more energy and resource efficient, as well as to reduce regional inequalities. Next, we'll hear from Anna Paskova, who is Director of Environmental Policy and Sustainable Development at the Ministry of Environment in the Czech Republic. Anna has worked in environmental policy for more than 12 years and is currently responsible for Agenda 2030 and its implementation, including implementation of the Czech Republic's National Adaptation Plan. Anna is also involved in the agenda of RRF plans, clean mobility transition, and light pollution issues. Then we will hear from Dr. Kim Yates, who is the UK and Europe Sustainability and Climate Change Lead for our knowledge partner today, Mott MacDonald. With over 25 years global experience, she works with clients to develop and deliver their net zero ambitions. Kim has developed Mott MacDonald's innovative Carbon Portal, a web-based carbon calculation tool for infrastructure projects. And most recently, she developed and implemented McDonald's own global carbon neutral strategy and action plan. So they're also walking the walk, not just talking the talk. And finally, last but definitely not least, we'll hear from Dirk Rutgers, who is Policy Analyst at the OECD Environment Directorate. He has worked in the field of energy economics, climate mitigation policy, and green finance for more than 12 years, with more than 5 years of those at the OECD. His current work focuses on analysis of institutional investment in sustainable infrastructure. As part of the OECD Centre on Green Finance and Investment, Dirk has regularly represented the OECD at high-level events and is responsible for organising OECD's events on green finance policy. So as I said, we have a great panel there. Please do message in your questions as we go along. But without further ado, I'm going to ask Ivo to kick us off with the first presentation. Over to you, Ivo.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much, Siobhan. It's such a great pleasure to be in front of such a global audience. Dear colleagues, other public servants, it's a pleasure to be here. To introduce myself and my focus today, I want to say that I will focus mostly on the topic of energy, energy efficiency, housing. Before building all of those new resources of energy production, we have to take a step back a little bit and think why or how do we use that energy. Maybe there are opportunities to actually cut the use of energy, to use it in a more smart way. And another thing that relates to the housing policy is that housing is very, let's say, bottom-up topic. There are so many owners of buildings, and the challenge or even responsibility of greening our economy lies before all of those owners. So to go to the next slide, I will describe a little bit the Estonian context, why it is so important. Estonia itself, in terms of size, it's about the same size as Belgium or Switzerland or Denmark. The population itself is many times smaller. Therefore, we cannot afford to be inefficient. We need to find ways to be efficient in our energy efficiency achievements. There are, well, as we're quite dispersed in the country, I myself right now at the second largest island of Estonia, fortunately I have a good internet connection and everything, but there are still so many households living in apartment buildings. And other buildings also, they consume a lot of energy. About half of Estonian energy is consumed in buildings, and a majority of it is consumed in apartment buildings. And in comparison, the EU average is about 40%. So next slide, please. Introduction to the construction of Estonia. There are some very good breakthroughs from last years. On the right side, you see at that time, at 2017, the world's tallest timber building, which was completed in Bergen, Norway, with Estonian manufacturers' modules. And on the left side, you see completely renovated, nearly zero energy building, which used to be old, ugly Soviet building block, which some of those you see in the background there as well. Now it's a modern, energy efficient home. And you see on the roof, it's also producing energy. So next slide, please. As other European countries, Estonia has compiled its long-term renovation strategy. And well, you don't have to stare too long to understand that we have to increase our volumes of renovation many times in the next couple of decades. apartment buildings are doing quite fine thanks to government and European support, but there are other building types that need to be helped along. But we're sure that the good experience in the last decade with apartment buildings can show the way. Next slide. What the strategy brings about, in addition to energy savings, in addition to CO2 savings, there are so many things like better indoor air quality, which is not thought about too much. Estonian solution usually favors central ventilation, so that every apartment has its own good air exchange. Buildings will be safer. In certain cases, heritage would be preserved. Buildings would be more flexible in terms of use in the future. As I mentioned, locally produced energy like PV panels and other potential local energy sources. Regional development. We are trying our best to direct the funding to neighborhoods outside of larger cities, so that everybody in the regions would be also part of this green development, and people would be more thoughtful about their own property, about making it more environmentally friendly. And also the building's relation to public space shouldn't be understated as well. For instance, in regards to traffic, like cars, charging networks, perhaps more and more charging would happen at apartment buildings. Therefore, the local energy production will be more important as well. Next slide, please. Here, as I mentioned, we cannot be inefficient, so we have to find ways to make renovation more industrial. So here is an example of factory pre-made panels, which are put on the old Soviet building block as a Lego. Many of you have seen conventional renovation, which happens behind the scaffolding for many months. But with this solution, the most of the renovation will take part in weeks, in a couple of weeks. And this is what we are stimulating from government side as well. Next slide. And to talk more about efficiency, we have to talk about data, about digital opportunities. We find that static data of energy performance certificates, it's starting to become insufficient, a little bit redundant for modern needs. We have to utilize remotely readable data that is dynamic. Sometimes, of course, all the data cannot be centrally gathered, so some predictions could be made, which is also possible. And of course, the data has to be sufficiently secure. Real-time consumption data is needed for the market, for energy efficiency services to be provided, to be promoted to each and every apartment association that could be suitable for such services. It opens the door for real-time carbon footprint measurement, so that every building owner can see their potential savings or potential savings to the environment when considering certain improvements to their building. Of course, it helps to improve building logbooks. It helps to keep renovation passports up to date and personalized. It helps to start services such as notifications of overconsumption or certain alerts, like for predictive maintenance and so on. So this data should also be visual. Estonia in a couple of weeks will launch a 3D twin of the whole country, which is based on real-time data only, based on data from different registries and information systems of the country, and it also has links to potential private services in the future. Next slide. So to conclude, we really have to, as I mentioned in the beginning, we have to tap into the cheapest energy potential, which is saved energy, and which is the responsibility of so many of us, of a bottom-up initiative. And the valuable additional result, or actually maybe even the most important result, is that we would transform our built environment. The renovated buildings should not be only kept alive, they should provide us completely modernized built environment that our children would be happy to live in. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Eva. That's such a great way to start this webinar, because I think when a lot of people talk about green infrastructure, you know, a sustainable kind of growth going forward, people tend to think about maybe transport issues, big infrastructure projects. They think less, I think, about our built environment, and so much of what we need to do is about renovating what we already have, I think. So really good to see some of those new techniques that you are doing there, but your emphasis on the need to increase the pace of change, that although you're doing a lot, it's not fast enough yet if we want to meet all of our targets. But also, it's always good to have somebody from Estonia on these events, because you always talk about using data in ways I think that other countries are still thinking about. And I think you're a real world leader in that. So just having that example at the end of how we can use real-time data to really get a sense of what's happening and drive in efficiencies is really interesting to see as well. Thank you so much. I'm now going to ask Anna for her presentation.
Thank you, and hello everyone, and greetings from Prague, at the heart of Central Europe. To start, I would like to just say that Czechia has about 10 million inhabitants, so we are a little bit bigger than Estonia. But thank you, Eva, for a great presentation, because as it comes for construction, and because of the same Soviet heritage, both countries have our buildings, the block of houses are also similar here around the Czech Republic. But today I would like to share with you the perspective from the Czech Republic on how to meet the challenge of green and just transition, as maybe sometimes it may become a buzzword, but we really need to stick to this transition, as is the only way forward, seeing climate change crisis and biodiversity loss. And as the Czech Republic is part of the European Union, we are not alone, and we are acting within the EU's framework, goals, instrument, and also financial resources. Next slide, please. So when talking about a strategic setting, I have to mention that in 2019, European Green Deal was launched. Is overall strategy of the European Commission under Ursula von der Leyen, and it sets over vision of the EU, which reacts, as I said, to the aggravating climate change and biodiversity loss. And the priority goal is to become the first neutral continent globally in 2050. And also another priority objectives address the way how we generate energy savings, mobility, agriculture, and also toxic-free environment. So it's pretty complex deal. On the national level, we have our new state environmental policy, which is adopted just in January this year and is closely connected to European Green Deal. And our priority objectives are divided in 3 sectors: cutting pollution and building resilience to changing environment so we can live in healthy environment. Also, transition to climate neutrality and circular economy. And third, restoring nature and biodiversity and building resilient ecosystem in where the climate change manifestation pressures will will allow us. So the main challenges for green transition for coming decade for the Czech Republic is to change our energy mix. First, phasing out coal. The coal phase out will be set either for 2033 or 2038, and the government will decide soon. Secondly, we have to increase the portion of renewable energy sources and increase energy efficiency in buildings and industry as well. But on the other hand, we have to focus also on measures that will enable us to cope with the climate change impacts, especially drought. We need to take measures towards better water retention in landscape, better water usage, recycling, gray water usage, etc. Next slide, please. And the question is, when the task is clear, the question is where all the money will come from. So for the Czech Republic, there will be several sources based on the multi-annual financial framework, European Union multi-annual financial framework, or returns from EU ETS trading scheme. It has to be viewed that we put together the mosaic of available funding to support our transition goals. And we have to say that all programs are currently under preparation on national level with national stakeholders and with the European Commission, and they will be approved either this year or next year. Next slide, please. So here is just the mosaic, as I said, how we are putting it together. The main areas of interventions of different funds will aim towards energy saving, renewable energy, change in sources for heating plants, clean mobility, adaptation and water infrastructure, circular economy, biodiversity, recultivation and restoration after the coal phase out, and also air pollution. And last but not least, also environmental education, which is very important to raise awareness why we are doing all of those things. And it's also important even within the COVID crisis. Next slide, please. This is our operational program environment, so-called regular program under European structural funds. We will fund energy savings in public buildings and apartment buildings from this source, like schools, retirement homes, and also renewable sources within those public buildings and households. Also adaptation measure, water infrastructure, waste management, and also measures for transition towards circular economy and biodiversity. Next slide, please. One of the new funds is Modernization Fund. It will be for the next decade. And this funding is dedicated to support lower income member states of the EU, like Czech Republic or also Estonia, in their transition to climate neutrality. So the major projects will be funded from this fund, as we have to change or we have to sustain our central heating system. Also, so we need to move with big projects to change the sources of heating plants, but also clean mobility, community energy is one of big questions that we need to move forward. Next, please. Another new source is Just Transition Fund. And this fund is dedicated only to regions where the coal mining is going on or used to go on. And it will be dedicated to redeployment, reskilling, upskilling of workers, education, but also to digitalization projects. And it's aimed towards small and medium enterprises mainly. At this picture, you can see one of our recent recultivation projects. It's called Milada Lake, and it's a recreation site after all of coal open pit mine restoration. So those projects will be also funded from this Just Transition Fund. Next slide, please. New Green Savings program. I would like to say that this program is open since 2009, and it's pretty successful. It's a program where individual household can gain investments or funding for households renovation. We started only with insulation, but as the program proceeded for the next period, we will be funding not only insulation, but also building in passive standard, solar thermal photovoltaic systems, but also adaptation measures like green roofs, and also the mechanism for water savings. And this fund will be also, the money will come from the revenues of EU allowances. Next slide, please. So the last but not least, but with the COVID crisis, the newest one is the amount of money coming from Rescue and Recovery Facility, European Union's Rescue and Recovery Facility, and it will transfer towards our National Recovery Fund. It will be important amount of money to build back better and to make the transition faster. In our National Recovery Fund, we will focus on digital projects and infrastructure and green projects. Also with some parts of labor market reskilling, research and development investment, and also health and resilience, as the money has to be dedicated also to building resilience, obviously. What is important that this recovery fund has to comply with set parameters. So we have to have 20% of digital measures or measures towards digital transition, and 37% of climate measures aiming at climate change mitigation or adaptation. And the rest of the recovery funds has to comply with do no significant harm principle, which is set under European taxonomy. And you have to take measures that are not harmful towards common goals, as is mitigation, adaptation, water resources, circular economy, pollution prevention, and biodiversity and ecosystem restoration. So I think for the mindset and maybe significant change in how countries are going to invest the possible funding, it is really a change breaker, because this is really the first time that we are doing this, I would say, exercise, but that we also agreed to really comply with do no significant harm principle. And it's not only like about this green oath, but we are also implementing it in investment planning.
Thank you.
So next slide, and I'm finished. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Anna. I think, again, what you've set out there so clearly is just the scale, I think, of the challenge that's facing countries around the world. So talking about all of those policy areas, from the kind of shift in energy use and energy production, the source of energy, moving away from coal to renewables, talking about transport issues around the built environment, housing, and everything. Good to see some success stories already, those individual grants to like domestic adaptation projects, that's going well, but also really interesting maybe for people in the rest of the world to see the kind of EU framework under which the member states are operating, and how some of those funding pots are driving change, and in particular that final one around those criteria now for the post-COVID recovery work, and really forcing people to think about, if they want that investment, how it has to meet those certain criteria. So thank you so much for that. Before we come over to Kim, I've just noticed somebody in the Q&A has actually mentioned about, could we make the slides larger on the screen. Because we're on Zoom, that will be down to you individually. I think if you play around a bit with your setting on your screen and go to change the speaker view, maybe you can play around with that. It does depend on whether you're on a tablet or a laptop or a phone and all of those kind of things, but it's not at our end, I don't think. Anyway, Kim, over to you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. It's quite hard to follow on the heels of the previous two speakers talking about whole countries, but I'm going to be talking about how we're trying to deliver as a engineering and design consultancy. And I'd also like to add we're very proud to be knowledge partners in this event because it's close to our ethos. So if we move on to the next slide, please. So what I'm going to be talking about is just focusing on carbon reduction and the net zero carbon neutral agenda that we all have across the world. And particularly in the UK, we had legislation come through in 2019 that as a country, we're going to be net zero. What we're finding in the environment that we're working in is that to achieve that net zero by 2050, that we're working in an absence of policy, though it's catching up very, very quickly, and we're having to go above and beyond compliance to hit net zero and build green infrastructure. So the net zero challenge, I think we've already talked about this very, very eloquently by the previous speakers, but it can be broken down nice and easily into making sure that you have a clean energy supply, increasing the efficiency, flexibility, and the way that we're using energy, whether that be materials as well, and what we're doing. And where we can't get those actual reductions in carbon, we're removing carbon from the atmosphere, whether that is removal via natural-based solutions, planting, carbon capture storage, even concrete. If it's pulverized, for example, it absorbs CO2 from the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So this is what we're living in. So if you can move on to the next slide. And this slide shows quite nicely is that to build green infrastructure, to hit our net zero targets, to keep our temperatures to 1.5 degrees C by 2050. We can't work in our silos, we can't work in isolation, and everything has an impact. So when we're working on large infrastructure projects that we're quite often involved in, we need to be looking at not just the improving of the environment, reducing the carbon dioxide, for example. We need to see how it fits into the economics and the social infrastructure, so that you actually have what's termed as a flourishing system overall. So you have all this interconnectivity. So it's no good us just putting up a road in the middle of a city and not taking into account all the various things that are feeding into that. So, but also I think what Ivo was going into an awful lot is driven by understanding the system that you're working in and data, and using data intelligently to inform what you're going to do next. So there you go. I've started off very, very high level. Basically, we all need to work together to hit this crisis, and that's something that we're working on, and we're very aware that we can't just be working in our silo. If I can move on to the next slide. But I'm going to focus in on infrastructure and what we can do in terms of carbon. And again, focusing on the UK scenario, is that what we're finding in the UK is that our carbon dioxide emissions are coming down, whether that's using transport, where our vehicles are getting cleaner, our grid is getting cleaner. But what we're finding that in infrastructure, in the capital carbon that is being emitted by use of steel, concrete, asphalt, or whatever, that is continuing to go up, and that's not following the overall downward trend. And of course, as an engineering consultancy and design consultancy, we have a great opportunity to influence that and bring that down. And that's something that we've been working on way before the net zero agenda came into place, and building that in how we deliver projects. If I can move on to the next one. What we've shown over the years is that if you're thinking right at the beginning of your project, of your infrastructure project, building project, that's when you can start to make a real difference. And it goes back to what Anna was saying in terms of it's a way of thinking. If you build in those objectives right at the beginning, and ideally, though it sounds a little bit weird for a consultancy to say build nothing, that is the perfect scenario. And again, it's looking at what you're building. Can you renew an asset? Do you really need it? And it's building that thinking in. Then as you move down through the project life cycle, when you're getting into the concept stage, the definition of it is, can you do something with less, or can you build in something like alternative energy sources into the design or whatever. And then we move further and further down, and what you find certainly within our industry is that by the time we get into designed construction, normally, unless as a company you're building it into your thinking at the front, is everyone turns around and goes, oh, can we do some carbon reduction? Can we make this more environmentally friendly? And by then, the opportunities to actually facilitate that building of the green infrastructure become less and less. And you can see that quite clearly, that when it's gone out to construction, it becomes harder to realise those goals. So effectively, I think we've touched on systems of systems thinking. It's thinking above and beyond the project that you're focusing on at that time, and looking at it as a whole, but also building this type of thinking and processes and digital and data analysis right in at the beginning, and making it part and parcel of what you deliver. I've got a nice little thing that says cut carbon, cut cost. Way back in 2013, we co-wrote we wrote the infrastructure carbon review that showed a very clear relationship between cutting carbon and cutting cost in your infrastructure projects, which is a bit of a no-brainer. If you use less material, less energy, it becomes less expensive. Not true in every case, but it's a good rule of thumb for going forward. So again, if we can go on to the next one. So again, as a company, you can't advise clients, you can't work with clients if you're not, as Siobhan said, prepared to walk the talk. So as a company, global company, we became carbon neutral in our operations in 2020. So last year, and we have the objective to become net zero in 2040. And this is a much wider conversation. So it's not just looking at our operational, it's embedding what we do in a net zero world into our projects, into our supply chain, and across the board, and how we can influence that. So that's given you a rough idea as to delivering this green infrastructure from a practical perspective, and what we need to be thinking about, and how we're doing it on the ground. And it just remains for me to say thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kim. Really good to have that perspective of an organisation that partners with government, with the public sector. Interesting what you said there. Maybe we can come back to that a bit in the discussion afterwards about the absence of policy. That's really, I think that goes back to what Anna was saying, and I think what Ivo was saying as well, about we're doing a lot, but it's probably not enough, and there's more to be done. So I think more policy is required there. Very much like what you said about the need for everybody to work together and to break out of silos. And I think we can come to that as well, because I'm interested in the individual role in this as well as the kind of state and public sector. And we can talk about that afterwards as well. But also there, I really like the, do you need to build it in the first place? You know, because that building less might be the right thing to do. And it's not often that you hear a kind of consultancy maybe saying that. So really nice to say that. Before we come over to our final panel member, just a reminder to the to everybody watching, please do message in any of your questions, because we've got a really diverse group of panel members here. So no question is a silly question. Anything that you want to ask about building back better green infrastructure, please do ask those questions at any point. And last but not least, we are going to head over to Paris now, where we're going to hear from Dirk. Thanks very much, Dirk.
Thank you so much, Johan, and also thank you for the invitation, of course. That's very pleased to be here, to be invited, and to talk a little about green infrastructure, my personal hobby horse here at the OECD, if you will. And as you know, I've already said it, but you can also see easily, I'm working at the OECD. Specifically, I'm working at the Center on Green Finance and Investment at the OECD. And before I go into a little bit of topical, a little bit of something topical, I quickly just want to introduce you to what this center does. So it was brought to life in 2016, and basically it was our attempt to, or was our way to bring the work that's done across the OECD, and by that I mean the OECD's secretariat, so the analytical work that was done here on green finance and investment under one roof. At the time, it became clear that not just climate economics would become important, but specifically climate finance and investment would play a huge role in the years forward. And as we've seen, we've been being proved right on that. So we needed a roof to put all that work under, and we formed the Center on Green Finance and Investment, where we work with, first of all, our target audience, policymakers, so the public servants that are listening right now. And also, for us to convene with colleagues. But this is the internal view. On the external view, we're working together with a host of stakeholders from the private sector, institutional investors like pension funds, insurance companies, banks, and asset managers. We also work with others who are in the field of knowledge creation, like data and ratings providers. Not least on the data has been mentioned a couple of times already, not least on the developments and necessities on data in the financial market to be able to govern and steer what's going on in green finance. And also with research institutions, universities, philanthropies. And as I said, we're trying to be a convener, not just for us in the house, but obviously also for other stakeholders, even beyond the list that I just kind of rattled off. And our main flagship event for the center is the Forum on Green Finance and Investment, where I'm sure a couple of people who are listening have been at already this year, on the 11th to 14th October. So I'm advertising this quite a bit earlier, realizing that, but I can assure you we've already started preparing, since it's usually a large event. So as you can see, 120 speakers, and last year, since it was virtual, we had almost 4,000 participants. Enough of the advertising, really. And I want to talk a little bit about the topics that we work on here. It goes across all kinds of sectors that contain green finance and investment. So, for example, a work stream on finance for biodiversity. Since last year, working on green taxonomies and definitions. We had a flagship report that kicked us off on that, and we think it's a really important topic. Currently has been in the EU ever since the EU taxonomy has been started as a project, and we dedicate a full work stream to standards, labeling, ESG, all kinds of other measurements in the financial sector. to these kinds of topics. And most recently, we've started including work on environmental materiality in this. So if you are close to the EU institutions, you might have heard of double materiality. So that basically means that firms can look at their financial effects on their financial materiality from an environmental perspective, but environmental materiality are the effects of the company or of corporates on the environment. And we think this will be a forthcoming big topic. We're sure this is a forthcoming big topic. You can, on the EU side, you already see when you talk to finance and green finance policymakers, you see this topic coming up a lot recently. And notably, we also have a long-standing work stream on private sector mobilization and institutional investors. And on the next slide, I would like to introduce you to one particular report that we recently published on, and very topical for this panel, on green infrastructure in the decade for delivery, where we looked specifically at institutional investors. When you talk about private finance and private sector coming into infrastructure creation, this is has been for at least 10 years a big discussion. How do you get in institutional investors? How do you get in the insurance companies, pension funds who have the large and deep pockets of patient capital? And surveys over the last years have shown that very small portions of their portfolios have been spent on infrastructure, or held in infrastructure, I should say. And so that despite the long discussion, no solution, and also no good overview, we aim to change that. As in a data-based organization, evidence-based organization, we shed light on how institutional investors hold infrastructure, and to be able to then advise policymakers on how to intervene to make that portfolio greener. And I apologize in advance here for to the people who had problems with the slide sizes. I know this figure must be fairly small on your screen, so apologies for that. I won't go into a lot of detail, but just to mention that the granularity in the data that we have and that we gathered through multiple sources allows us to look into exactly who among the institutional investors holds what kind of, so that's on the left side of the figure, if you can follow that, holds what kind of infrastructure. That's on the right side of the figure. So, and by that, by the way, I mean physical infrastructure, so utility kind of infrastructure. And how these institutional investors hold that, i.e. which instruments do they use. And this picture you see here, which goes over covers 6 infrastructure sectors and the 4 biggest types of institutional investors, shows you the investment in the real economy as opposed to investment in directly held corporate stocks and bonds. And this real economy investment holding of institutional investors is 1.04 trillion, which may sound like a big number, but if you consider that institutional insurance companies and pension funds in OECD and G20 countries alone have 64 trillion in terms of portfolio, this isn't quite the big number anymore suddenly. And also these 1.04 trillion is only 30% green, so only 314 billion of that is green. All that to say, this report, one of many in the we published through the OECD Center on Green Finance and Investment. It contains granular data on the holdings of institutional investors, and when you start to look at the whole at how institutional investors hold these infrastructure assets, you see some aspects that governments can intervene into. Governments obviously have the role to regulate, including financial markets, can be players in financial markets, especially if they hold public pension funds are involved here, and can mobilize institutional investment. It was curious to me earlier when Anna showed her presentation that when listing funds, those were the funds of governments, but governments also have the chance to leverage their investments or leverage investments of institutional investors. bring in the private money. And in our report, we find that aside from lots of levers in terms of climate policy, there's also something to be done specifically to get in private finance, like building pipelines, making sure, so pipelines of investable projects is what I mean, not physical pipelines. So making sure that there is something to invest into, making sure that a market is being built of the kind of infrastructure that is needed for policy objectives to be fulfilled. Making sure that the ways this can be invested in, so the financial instruments are allowed. You see, for example, and this is the one detail that I will pull out here, in the very middle of the chart, something called YieldCo, which is basically a company putting together projects in one pot and making that sellable over stock markets in really small units or in really large tranches, and to get to institutional investors, which large amounts of money they can invest. That's a perfect instrument to use, a really good instrument to use. Fits the appetite of institutional investors. However, these are not allowed in all countries, and there some exist that are some instruments like that exists that are palatable to institutional investors that are geared towards fossil fuel only, for example. So what I'm saying is allow the right instruments, make sure that the government has a good plan and publishes that, has transparency on the pipeline of projects that are invested in, and make sure that whoever on the private side buys these or invests in these projects has an ability to do so. If it's a really big investor with huge tranches, or really small investor like your private saver, government doesn't need to cater to that. The government has to give the private finance a chance to cater to that. I think I'll keep it at that.
Thank you so much. And that provides such a great sort of a different perspective on this from what we've heard so far from the panel. And I think getting that overview of what you do in the OECD and why the centre was brought together, really interesting. But just that also you touched on there, you know, how do governments start measuring organisations, private sector organisations, in a different way? So not just their impact on traditional ways in the economy, but also their impact on the environment. I think really important. That's something lots of people are talking about. But just that's what you put up there in that slide, which really I think certainly made me think that we do tend to look to private sector funding, public sector funding for a lot of these things. But actually, there's only so much governments and civil services can do if we don't get and mobilise all of that money, the money that's in the private sector, that's in these, as you say, these institutional investors, then we're only going to go so far. And I think that's a real key to unlocking the bigger kind of the pace of scale of kind of change that we need. So thank you so much for all of those brilliant presentations. We do have a couple of questions already. Please keep them coming in. I want to kick off with one of my own, if that's all right, now that we've heard from all of our panel. And it was something I think, Ivo, that you touched on right at the beginning in your presentation, but it just strikes me that after as we come out from the pandemic, finances are going to be even tighter than they were before for governments. And they're dealing with so many immediate priorities, as well as thinking about these longer term issues. So what are your thoughts, all of you, on kind of how easy it's going to be for government to decide on their investment priorities? Is there a danger that maybe some of these things start to take a back seat again, as governments tend, have to be firefighting some of their immediate things they've got to deal with? But also, I think Ivo mentioned in particular, how do you deal with, for example, within a country, regional inequalities, and how do you direct investment maybe within a country to different areas within that country? There's a lot of talk in the UK, for example, of levelling up, making sure that investment goes to the north and not just the south. So just your thoughts in general, I think, on government priorities. Will green issues take a back seat? And also, how do those kind of regional inequalities, do you think, how are they going to play out? I'm going to change the order a little bit. Anna, I'm going to come to you first for your thoughts on this.
Thank you. Well, I mentioned in my presentation that we will have some priority regions because we are sticking towards our climate goals, and we are going to phase out the coal. So those priority regions will be the coal regions where the funding will be bigger or larger. And then we will focus on different topics. I wouldn't say that the green priorities will be side-backed. I think the green priorities will still remain priorities, because also the ideas in the community or of citizens, they are changing, you know, so they are they really want to make the shift. I mean, because I don't know, a couple of years ago, people didn't understand what does it mean, climate change and adaptation. But since really citizens felt how it is to feel the long-term drought, and that this is the one of the manifestations, so they understood that we really need the change. And also we suffered from bark beetle calamity, so we are losing our carbon sinks. Massive reforestation projects has to be launched, and they are launched to gain back our forests. So people are really understanding what will happen, or that is already happening, if we are not going to change the management of landscape, and that we are not going to do something about mitigation and be part of the lead of the EU. So I think the mindset is changing. So that's why the green priorities are not going to be aside. I would be maybe worried about like the national budget and how are we going to sustain all the social goals of Agenda 2030, because as tighter it will get this year, next year, it will be really difficult from my point of view to have the money for the people that really need it, for single mothers, single parents, elderly people, etc.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. Yeah, I think COVID certainly exposed some deep-rooted inequalities that I think governments are going to now need to address. Kim, I'm going to come to you for your thoughts on this one.
Right. So well, it certainly sideswiped the green agenda, but from what I'm seeing from a global perspective, is that I have never seen so much activity within the infrastructure sector, at any rate, that is about greening and about low carbon. And this is from my colleagues in the US, from Australia, as well as in the UK. In fact, we saw an upsurge in inquiries and work, certainly when Biden came in earlier this year. And again, I've never seen that for years. So it does mean that governments have to reprioritize, but I can't see it going down the agenda, because I don't think the citizens will allow it. We all have to do something.
Yeah, I like that it's not just political leadership, it's also bottom up now, I think, from citizens. Dirk, I'm going to come to you.
Thank you. So your question was partly on government prioritization, and that, you know, as you basically said yourself and others already, you know, the crisis is the first priority, fighting the crisis is the first priority, and connected to that, stimulus packages that are recovery packages that are now doled out. And in a recent analysis, we had a look at these from an environmental perspective, and you know, we checked everything that was in these recovery packages that could have had or could have an environmental impact, negative, positive, or mixed. And you know, on the one hand, there's a lot of talk of building back better, and that should mean building back greener. And certainly these crises offer an opportunity for change and for substantial and transformational and radical change. So we would need to seize that opportunity. But as far as we could see in the numbers, and I have to caveat, they weren't 100% transparent, or you couldn't 100% exactly say what was spent on what. But where we could tell it, what was environmentally harmful, helpful, or mixed, yet, you know, about the same sum for environmentally helpful as for green, if you will. And weighing on one side and on the other side mixed and negative impacts. And a lot of the potentially environmentally related investments, it wasn't transparent if they actually were having an impact or not. So in the end, I would say, governments focusing right now with their investments in recovery packages, it may pay to have a second look there, to be transparent on what's actually invested in, set these kinds of goals that Anna mentioned earlier, how much needs to be invested in green, and being very clear on what not to invest in, which the EU taxonomy certainly has within the EU, and where else it is applied. But I think so far we only saw that in the EU. And make sure that funds that aren't earmarked like that, that there are guidelines set on simple things like public procurement, but also the larger types of projects and sectors. And a second thing, but basically I would be repeating myself here, is that if there's a priority of how to spend funds on green during this crisis, and there's the ability to do that through stimulus packages, it is worthwhile considering activating private investors through, say, national development banks or more specialized institutions that a country may have.
Great. And I think one of the things that came up in all of the presentations was, if you do these investments in kind of green infrastructure, there are a whole host of other benefits as well, which could be taken into account, which makes the business case for those investments even stronger. So I think really important. Ivo, you brought this up, I think, in your presentation, that sense of kind of regional, in particular regional kind of equalities. But what's your thoughts on whether this might get hit by kind of immediate concerns following the pandemic?
Well, I think this green investment trend that is going on, it's actually a great opportunity for rebalancing our regional development, because there's a lot of funds available, as Anna, Dirk, everybody's mentioning that Estonia is also very much dependent on European structural funding. It's our role from the government side to direct this funding to everybody in need. And we see that there is a lot of need, especially at those regions outside from major cities. We also encounter serious market failures, as well. I'm talking from the housing point of view. Renovation happens, well, usually is taken with, you need, let's say, commercial loans to renovate your buildings. And in certain areas, actually in majority of our country, banks will not provide loans to renovate your even apartment buildings, also single family houses. And this is the place where the government has to step in. And we have certain plans for that during the next financing period, by actually utilizing private funding as well. The benefit of using institutional money is that it could provide more stable development. Government funding can be very cyclical, and this has quite harmful effects to the industry, to both to the industry, but also to the demand side, because the owners themselves, they cannot really trust the potential funding in the future. So the preparations are perhaps not that well thought out. To conclude, I think there are a lot of opportunities with this new funding coming with the new green policies, and we have to direct it in a smart way. We have to direct it in a way which helps also to improve the quality of local life, for instance, by densifying local centers.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of talk about that. People living now in a, the 15-minute city kind of approach that they're adopting in Paris, things much closer to you where you live and work. So thanks. We've got lots of questions coming in. Before we move on to a couple of those, just want to say, everybody watching, you should have been emailed a survey that will be in your inboxes, I think. So if you could take a few moments, because we're constantly making improvements to these events, we want to make sure we give you all what you like. So if you have a few minutes afterwards to fill that in, that would be great. But let's go on to a couple of questions. And because we've got a few coming in, I'm going to take a couple together, and then I'm going to invite the panel members to answer one or both of them. So we have one here, which is, what are your views on green infrastructure and the agriculture and food sector production? So from processing to waste management and animal farming, all of those kind of issues. We haven't really touched on those, but I know there's lots of talk about those in the kind of general narrative around climate change. And then also, what's your thoughts on the role of hydrogen in greening economies and countries? So two there, what are your thoughts on questions? One about kind of agriculture and food sector, and one on hydrogen. Kim, I'm going to come to you first.
Okay, so I want to caveat that agriculture is not my strong point. However, if we go back to what I was talking about, is that systems of systems thinking, is that certainly if you look at food waste, the biomethane that can be created for that. Again, you've got a clean energy source from that. Again, it's that thinking of, well, from a personal perspective, I think that there is a lot of potential and synergies for that. In the traditional engineering designing world, we don't necessarily think of that, but I think it's coming more and more to the fore. The other question was hydrogen. Certainly within the UK, we're in this, I don't know if anybody remembers the Betamax and the VHS videos all those years ago. We seem to be in that hiatus of, do you go for hydrogen? Do you go for VHS? Sorry, hydrogen, do you go for fully electric? I personally think that hydrogen has a large role to play, but it does need a very big investment to get that infrastructure up and running, particularly getting the right, the green hydrogen in place. So I think it has a very large role to play. But all this space is about innovation, thinking differently. So I think they can all work together in what we're trying to deliver.
Thanks, Kim. And I'm conscious these are very broad, wide-ranging discussions. So feel free, if you're one of the panel members, and say, no, actually, I don't know about these. But Dirk, I'm going to come to you, your thoughts on either agriculture or hydrogen.
I'm neither an expert on transport nor on waste, but I'll try my hand at the, a comment on hydrogen. And I also think we're in this situation that Kim just described, VHS with the Betamax, so which system do we want to implement here? And well, technically there's no reason not to have both. The situation is different from country to country. My home country, Germany, for example, does have a lot of the infrastructure in place already, maybe not at scale, but it does exist for hydrogen, and is building that up more massively than other countries are, partly because it already existed. So looking into that option and being also somewhat brave, like certain countries were when solar and wind were first adopted, fostering and building a market and fostering the innovation behind it will be important here. And on the flip side of that, I would like to comment, it's probably a bad idea to pick the winner here, and rather, even if it's an experiment, but to experiment with both. And I think the EU, at large agrees to that as well.
Thanks, Dirk. Ivo.
Yes, thank you. Well, I'm not an expert on H2 at all, so maybe we can move on to the next question.
No problem. Anna, would you like to add any comments to these two, or do you want to move on to the next questions?
Well, I would just add on hydrogen, that indeed we count with hydrogen for the next decade. For example, we already created or funded so-called Hydrogen Valley project in Moravian Citizen region. And there is this perspective of having buses, trains, etc. Being run on hydrogen. So we will roll out from this region to others. But yeah, we count on that in the clean mobility action plan as well with hydrogen. But indeed, it needs more research to be done. So a lot of funding is dedicated also to research how to use it as an energy source in an efficient way and CO2 neutral way, as I would say. And when it comes to farming, there is huge potential. I agree with Kim. And changes will also happen within the EU based on a farm to fork strategy to support more organic funding, cut waste of food waste, and also looking at how to reduce the amount of fertilizers, and also how to get to the system thinking, as Kim said, how to use the nutrient and get it back to the land as well.
And certainly a lot of talk about kind of reducing the amount of meat that we consume as well, which would, I think, have a big impact on the kind of global carbon footprint as well. Thanks, everyone. We've literally got a couple of minutes left, so I'm just going to, again, I'm going to take one question. There's one very specific question around a big infrastructure project in the UK, which is, you know, do we need to rethink kind of HS2? And so if anybody wants to answer that one, they can. Kim, you might have some thoughts on that, but it's quite controversial in the UK. But I'm interested in this question. I think it's a nice final question, which is, as we move back to a world post-COVID where people might or might not go back to working in offices, do you think people are changing the way they think about how they want to work? And how do you think that might have an impact as well on kind of people's carbon footprint going forward? Do you think people want to stay at home, or do you think hybrid working? So just your thoughts on kind of that as your final wrap up before we go. And I'm going to come to Ivo. We'll come back to you for the first one on this.
Yes, thank you. Well, it's my personal opinion, but seeing those networks of services provided to your door, which has exploded in the last year, I think they're here to stay and probably improve. We can see in our country that people are more interested in their own homes, in improving their homes. I don't know, adding garden furniture, dealing with the gardens and so on. These industries are booming right now. I really feel that there are huge transformations going on right now.
Great, thanks, Ivo. Kim.
So what we're finding, certainly within our company, sorry, my phone's going off. What we're finding within our company is that rather than the office be something that you go to every day, it's the way that we're going to take it is use them as knowledge hubs and meeting places. So you don't do the 9 to 5 days a week. And it's, we've literally seen a paradigm shift across the globe in terms of that. So our traditional way of going in, being there 9 to 5 at your desk has completely changed. And I can't see us going back to the way we were before.
Thanks, Kim. Anna, is that the same thinking for you?
Yes, I agree. I would say the going back is not the way. I would say we would end up with some hybrid way of working. And also what our data showed, maybe we should not, as for Czech Republic, overestimate the home office, because from the last year, it showed only 1/3 of employees worked on home office for the whole country. It was like one half for Prague, for a big city, for administrative building, but as a whole, as a country, it was just 1/3. So also it will lead for better time management when you don't have to commute, and we can expect some emission cuts, but then maybe it will be the place will be taken by all the services and deliveries when it comes to, for example, emissions from commuting. So they will only shift. So we will see, and we will also have to check the data.
Great, thanks. Dirk, how are you feeling about working from home?
Actually, currently, I happen to be in the office, but for 1 day a week. And just generally, I think I'm, you know, maybe part of an extreme example here, because being an international organization, some people work from home, which for them means Australia, the US, Canada, which is makes for funny meetings. Some people on the way to bed, some people just got out of it. But apart from my personal or you know my office culture changing here, living in a densely populated area, this has some interesting implications also for climate through channels like, you know, how does transport evolve? How does, you know, as Ivo alluded to, how do living conditions evolve? You can already see that some Parisians, because they foresee that they won't be in the office 5 days a week, are moving further out to the suburbs, or the suburbs are extending further out. And, you know, do public transport systems now have to be thought differently, less densely maybe in the now very populated areas, and, you know, but stretching further out? There may have to be a paradigm shift based on the paradigm shift that we need for climate and other environmental reasons anyway. So I think this will be interesting times, but certainly also a lot of advantages, you know, spending more time with your kids.
Brilliant. Well, I guess time will tell and we will see, but the one thing's for sure, we've run out of time now, but certainly I think the pandemic and people working from home, if there's been any kind of small silver linings, there have been more of these types of events where we've managed to bring together great expertise from around the world with a truly global panel and a global audience. I'd like to thank all of you here today. I think we got through nearly all of the questions. Unfortunately, there was one came in near the end about greening airports, which I think would have been fascinating, but probably enough for the whole of a webinar in its own right, I think. I would like to thank everyone for sending in their questions, and a huge thank you to Dirk, to Kim, to Anna, and to Ivo for giving us their expertise and their time today. This video will be, we have recorded this, so we will be sending a link so that people watching, people that couldn't join because of time zones, they will be able to see this anyway on video, and there will be an article coming around as well with a write-up of some of the key messages which you're all free to share with your colleagues and your friends as well. For now, a very big thank you from me. A thanks again to our knowledge partner, Mock MacDonald, for being with us today. And I hope everyone, wherever you are, has enjoyed this. Please do join us for another webinar soon, and have a very good rest of the day wherever you are. Thank you to everybody, and goodbye for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a nice day. Bye.